Welcome to the Mind Solution podcast with Sarah Maud. The Mind Solution podcast is for leaders like you who are passionate about well-being in the workplace because you understand that a strong, resilient and happy workforce is the key to your organisation's success. The Mind Solution podcast is here to help you. So join us every week where we'll share with you powerful insights, strategies and know-how to ensure that your people and your organisation are truly thriving from the inside out. Hello and welcome, and I'm delighted to be joined by Perrine Farque, and Perrine is here to talk about her amazing book, Inclusion, the Ultimate Secret to an Organization's Success, which is a very big claim to make, an organization's top secret. So I'm delighted to welcome Perrine. But before we get into today, I also want to do a big shout out to FeedSpot, because FeedSpot have named us as one of the top 20 workplace podcasts. So thank you very much for that, FeedSpot. And back to you, Perrine. So hello.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And having looked at your book, it's just full of some really, really interesting wisdom. So before we get into the book, I'd love you to just share with our listeners a little bit about your background and actually what brought you to this point of creating this masterpiece of a book.
Of course. I'll give you the short version because I don't want to, go into too much detail. But essentially, I was always very much interested in the topic of social justice and fairness. So I studied law at university, but then I decided I did not want to become a lawyer. And instead, I started working in the technology world. So I worked for a few technology companies. And I was always fascinated by team dynamics and people dynamics and how people interact with each other and teams interact. Ever since my childhood, I remember back in the classroom, I was already observing how different groups perform better over others. And at university, when we're doing group projects, I was always fascinated to see how some groups always performed on time and achieved great scores, whereas other groups did not. And I was always very interested in the topic of team interaction and people interaction. And when I started working in the technology industry, which is a very white male dominated industry, I did experience personally a lot of what we would call today microaggressions. So feeling that, can you take notes, Perrine? Or can you schedule the next meeting? Or, can you organize the next baby shower? All the kind of small, subtle acts of, daily sort of, discriminations. But beyond that, I also experienced some working for great teams where there was a great dynamic and great leaders, but equally where I worked for a team where the environment was really sort of terrible and it was very hard to speak up. So with that, I decided to start my own firm and really help organizations create great teams that work well together. And so that's really at the intersection between workplace culture and team management and leadership, where we talk about how to create great teams, great environment where people and organizations thrive. So that's what I do today. And I help organizations, again, create what I call highly successful teams where people are happy and organizations perform well as well. And I do that through keynote sessions and workshop programs and coaching and consulting.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I take my hat off to anybody that's created a book. So I'd love to understand from your perspective, Perrine, what do you think that a great team actually looks like on a day-to-day level?
Such a great question. But do you know what? There are so many concepts that come into play, and I certainly use a specific framework. But one concept that comes over and over again when I talk about great teams, and it's a concept that people really love talking about, people who are employees, and certainly have a lot to say about that. And we talk a lot about psychological safety at work. And so the idea that, what does a great team look like? I have observed that great teams have a lot of psychological safety. So what is psychological safety? I think it's quite self-explanatory, but it's worth sort of, spending a minute or so to explain. It's really a climate or an environment where there is a lot of trust and mutual respect, and people feel comfortable speaking up. And especially there is no fear of repercussion, no fear of being ridiculed or being told off. And so that's a very hard environment to build. It's very hard if you work with teams, different managers and different people. It's very hard to create that kind of environment where there is so much trust that people are not afraid to share their ideas. People are not afraid to say that something has gone wrong or etc. So to answer your question about what makes a great team, I really believe that what makes a great team is a team where there is a lot of psychological safety and a lot of trust. And I could go on for a while about this topic, but this is a really key concept, which I think is at the heart of inclusion or create inclusive teams, where there is a lot of trust and a lot of psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And that term psychological safety, I certainly know from our perspective, it's one it's kind of quite a new word, but it's certainly one that we teach our managers on our management mental health training. How do you create, as you say, psychological safety? What does that actually look like? What signs are you putting out as a leader that lets people know that they're safe? And one of the things that we often point people to is the amazing TED Talk by Brené Brown on the power of vulnerability, and again, that underbelly of trust around that. So I think that's an excellent point. And you talked about inclusion, and there's been so many different variations of this term inclusion. I know from my human resources day, it was more equality and diversity, and now it's been termed inclusion. And I think sometimes I'm not sure what we call it these days. But again, I think it would be wonderful to, from your perspective, share with the listeners, what does that actually look like as well? What does inclusion actually mean?
Yeah, and I'd like to start by answering this, that there is a recent survey that's actually revealed that 50% of professionals are afraid to talk about diversity and inclusion for fear of saying the wrong thing. So I think it's partly answering your question that a lot of people feel a little bit scared by this term or overwhelmed by this concept of inclusion and diversity. What does it mean? Am I going to say the wrong thing? So I want to start by acknowledging it's a complicated topic. And I also think that, to your point, the definition has evolved over time. It's fair to say that the actual definition of diversity and inclusion in the workplace has evolved over the last few years, certainly over the last 12 to 18 months after Black Lives Matter and George Floyd in the US. But one way to describe inclusion is that it's a mindset and an attitude which is embracing the fact that everyone has value to add, that it's building a community that's accessible to everyone. And it also means sometimes adapting the environment or the work environment to make everyone feel welcome. So the feeling of inclusion, which is a feeling, is when employees, in our case, we're talking in the context of the workplace, employees feel seen, heard, valued, and respected. They feel that if they have an idea, they can share the idea with the group without fear of being ridiculed, like we said earlier. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit, but really for me, the concept of inclusion is at the heart is feeling seen and heard and valued for who we are, like we bring something to the table, which again, is very hard to achieve in a team, in a workplace.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is, I know from myself, I've held probably in the region of about 10,000 one-to-one sessions with people. So I've had front row seats into the mind of people, why they think what they think, because thought, we know, generates everything. And what I'm curious about is, how much, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about psychological safety, how much do you think that the relationship that we have with ourselves, first and foremost, plays a key role in inclusion?
Such a great question. I mean, I love this question. The answer is this is huge. I mean, I'm thinking back on my own experience, and as I'm reflecting back on my own experience when I worked in the corporate world, and I've worked in the corporate world for about 15 years. I remember that, especially at the beginning of my career as a relatively young and relatively new professional woman in the workplace, I certainly felt excluded a lot. I felt like my voice was not being heard and I was not being valued or respected. And I was very, very frustrated. But as I reflect back on that now with a little bit more experience, a little bit more maturity, I see how it was also my own internal imposter syndrome that played a huge part in me thinking I didn't have a voice, and me thinking I was not being valued. So I do think that there is both sides to the equation. There is one that's the factual sort of objective side, which is maybe I didn't speak as much in meetings, and maybe that's a fact. Maybe out of a meeting of an hour, I would only speak for 5 minutes. But then there is also what's the other story? Was I my own enemy by listening to my imposter syndrome and feeling that I was not good enough, or thinking I was not good enough? And so I've learned that actually I did have a voice, but maybe I didn't use it as much as I thought, or maybe I always had a voice, but it took me a while to realize I could use it. So to answer your question, I do think that our internal dialogue and our internal communication plays a huge role in how we feel included or not in a group. But equally, I do think that managers have a responsibility to make their teams feel included, and great leaders certainly have a responsibility, accountability to make their people feel included. And sometimes managers need to adapt their style to their people, because they might have a team where maybe someone is very extrovert and loud and confident, and maybe they need to calm them down a little bit and assist them in other ways. Whereas they might have a very introvert employee, someone who needs a bit of help and support, and they might need to, be a bit more mindful in how they speak to them and help them. So I think I think both parties in a one-to-one relationship have a role to play ourselves, but also the manager has a role to play with the employee.
And it's really interesting listening to you describe it in that way, Perrine, because I completely agree with you that discrimination does take place, bullying does take place, things that managers say and do that create that divide, that feeling of separation. And yet again, if we come back to what drives that at that really unconscious level, because we know that around about 96% of everything is at that unconscious level. So where managers maybe aren't even self-aware of the impact that they have on their team, that they might not be self-aware of their style and the way that they show up and the way that they speak to people, which I know sometimes you think, how can somebody not be aware? But if people genuinely, say you've got leaders that maybe haven't had any leadership coaching, any real one-to-one coaching that's helped them to create that level of self-awareness, then they're just going to keep doing what they've always done, which I know is also the definition of insanity.
Yeah,
do what you've always done and expecting a different result. So when it comes to an organization investing in inclusion, training and awareness, how important do you think it is to also back that up with leadership coaching?
It brings me to, and I'm glad you asked this question because I was going to go on to this, but it brings me to the idea of, certainly leadership development is absolutely huge. And I think a lot of what is called leadership development is essentially awareness, making, like you said very well, making people aware of certain things. So, awareness, and that brings me to a topic that I cover a lot in my workshops, around leadership training and manager training and inclusion training, which is the idea of microaggressions and unconscious bias. Because oftentimes leaders are very well intentioned, have very good intentions for their teams, and they might be saying things or doing things that have a lot of unconscious bias. So, for example, they might unintentionally promote men over women without realizing that maybe they hold certain bias towards women, thinking that maybe women want to spend more time at home with the kids and therefore wouldn't like a promotion. But again, that could come from a great intention, being really well intentioned. So the idea of when we talk about microaggression awareness for leaders, for example, I always say that the microaggression is often in the eyes of the recipient. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the exact same situation for one person might be perceived completely differently in comparison to another person. So let me share an example. So, for example, if let's say a male manager in a very male-dominated team might ask his only female team member to take notes during the meeting, one might be absolutely fine with that, saying, no problem, I actually love taking notes. I've always loved writing and organizing, that's my thing. And that female team member might be absolutely fine with that. You could take the exact same situation with another female. She might be outraged that she was asked to take notes because she was the only female in a meeting, the only woman, and therefore that was very perceived as something very discriminatory towards her gender. So that's an example of how one action could be perceived by someone as absolutely acceptable, but by someone else as absolutely not acceptable. So in the case of microaggression, there is a lot of awareness when it comes to unconscious bias. And so simply talking about these ideas and talking about, what are the most common unconscious bias in the workplace, what are the most common types of microaggression in the workplace, will really help those leaders become aware of some of their words and actions, and so they can improve and become better leaders. So back to your question around how important is leadership development. I do believe that leadership development is key to fostering very inclusive teams. And also it's about making leaders aware of concepts and ideas that they might not be otherwise aware of.
So it sounds like what you're saying, and correct me if I've heard this correctly, that actually for an organization to have a really effective approach to include their inclusion strategy, that there's almost kind of three pillars to it. So there's actually, as you say, teaching leaders, what do we mean by inclusion? What are the things that leaders perhaps are doing or saying unconsciously that can lead to discrimination, can lead to that feeling of separation, exclusion? That being one part of the pillar. The other pillar is the leadership coaching, that working with, like, for example, we do a lot of leadership coaching, working one-on-one with individuals to help to not only create awareness, but actually then to also rewire their responses, so that you're creating those fundamental shifts in their brain at that unconscious level that will help them to change their behavior. But then going back to what you said, also creating self-awareness within individuals themselves, so that the perceptual filters that they see situations through isn't necessarily always what they think, but the meaning that they place on that. So that level of self-awareness helps them to see where maybe there's a bit of an illusion of what they think is happening, but also where they do see things which are happening, that they feel safe to also speak out and raise their voice about it.
Absolutely, yes. I agree that one, leadership development is key. Two, leadership coaching is key as well. And three, people development as well. So we need to have these three actions happening at the same time. Whilst we're developing the leaders through programs, we also want to develop them through coaching, but also we also want to educate and make all the people aware of certain concepts. And to that, I'd like to add a recent statistic that I came across the other day, which was only 14% of CEOs think that they have leadership pool that's ready to take on the next level of challenges, meaning that today's leaders need more help with development and training, and certainly with the revolution, because I think we're experiencing a revolution with hybrid work and flexible work. With this revolution of hybrid work, most leaders have never been trained on how to manage a team in hybrid work. Why some of their people are in the office, some of their people are working from home, some of the people are partly working in the office and from home. Most leaders have never received any form of training or coaching on how to handle this. And so now more than ever, with those changes happening in the workplace, I really believe that leadership development is key for organizations to thrive in this new normal.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Out of interest, so when we work with an organization, one of the often common things that we hear coming back is that there's so much going on in the workplace, and trying to make hybrid working effective is a big one of them. And that a lot of managers are being put through various different training courses. Now, that might be inclusion, it might be unconscious bias, it might be management mental health, it might be this, it might be that. And so a lot of organizations sometimes say, we just haven't got the time. Our leaders don't have the time. And it's almost a sense of that chicken and egg approach, like which comes first? Do we need to really just put aside the time to invest in this key training in order to get the right results? Or do you know what I mean? And I wonder what your take would be for an organization that just feels like they've got so much training to go on.
Yeah, I do get this question a lot. I think in my experience, any form of learning and development or training, how you want to call it, I think it needs to be part of a bigger question. What are we trying to achieve? What's the purpose of this, right? So in the case of diversity and inclusion, for example, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve as an organization? So we take a moment to think about this initiative. Is this, are we hoping to create more inclusion in our team for is it because we think that having a more diverse workforce will help us create products that are more innovative? Is it because we want our workforce to be more representative of the society we live in? Whichever the reason, I think it's worth posing and asking ourselves, what are we trying to achieve? Because the first goal is to articulate your goal, and I always say, if you're gonna, as an organization, as an employer, you're gonna start your diversity and inclusion journey, start with why you're doing this, what is your goal, and really articulate your goal and write them down. And then the second stage, I would say, would be to incorporate that as part of your mission statement. So as an organization, you want to just revisit your mission statement, and if you really believe that diversity and inclusion is an important part of your culture, of your company culture, you want to incorporate that in your mission statement. It doesn't need to take 3 months, by the way. It can simply be revisiting your mission statement. And then start by setting goals, achievable goals, realistic goals, but goals that will move the needles in the direction you want to go. Because for one organization, diversity and inclusion might mean we want to have more gender balance in our workforce. For another organization, it might be we want more ethnic diversity in our leadership, for example. So whichever goals you are after, you want to make sure you write them down, you write those goals. And ideally, I always say you want to tie those goals to monetary compensation. The same way you would treat revenue and sales and say, we need to hit 50% increase revenue, year on year, and you're going to reward your salespeople for doing that. You also want to reward your leaders for hiring more diverse candidates and keeping those diverse candidates. So you really want to tie bonuses and leadership bonuses to this. So that's a simple sort of 3-step approach. Understand why you're doing this diversity and inclusion program, incorporate that as part of your mission statement, and articulate goals. And then the rest will come together. And you asked about training, whether it's too many trainings or we should make them mandatory or not. There is a lot of research that demonstrates that if a training is mandatory, it's most likely is going to backfire. So I always advise my clients to make the training voluntary, So not really forcing anybody to join the training, which, initially might seem counterproductive. Why would you pay for a training and not ask our employees to attend? But actually, surprisingly, we'll get great levels of attendance to those workshops, because it's a topic that employees are really hungry to understand more about. And also because we take the time to position this as part of a bigger initiative. It's not just this today, it's part of a 12-month, 24-month initiative. So I always invite my clients to get their CEO to send an email to the entire workforce, the actual CEO of the organization or the managing director, to say, as a company, we believe in diversity and inclusion because of X, Y, Z, and this is why we're starting this new initiative and we're going to do a series. So again, taking the time to get your leadership team to articulate to the workforce why we're doing this. And then ideally the training or workshop or learning and development should not be mandatory, but made voluntary. So that in my experience works really well.
Absolutely. I knew I was going to love you for a reason. And I love what you said about starting with what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest for any of our listeners, if you've not read the book, apart from Perrine's, Start With Why by Simon Sinek, then absolutely start with why, because I see so many organizations doing what I call throwing jelly against the wall and hoping that it sticks. So I absolutely love what you said there about starting with that understanding of what are we trying to achieve, why are we trying to achieve it, and then linking it, as you said, to the monetary goals and revenue of the business so that it's a commercial investment as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, for some people listening to this, they might be the CEO of an organization, and maybe they're thinking that, well, you know what, everyone around here gets on, we're all fine, we've got a diverse workforce, we don't need inclusion training. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I have to say I get this a lot. Unfortunately, I have to be honest, and I do get this a lot. And I don't know if it's partly due to maybe being over optimistic or maybe not being aware of how the workforce actually feels, but I do get that quite a lot. What I'd say is look at the facts and figures and the numbers. So I'd say get some survey, qualitative feedback and quantitative feedback. You really want to base your decision based on numbers. And so number one, I'd invite those CEOs to run employee surveys, employee pulse surveys, anonymous, asking about employee engagement. So it could be 5 simple questions around asking, I feel happy to work for XYZ company. I wouldn't look for another job, in the next 5 years, and just get a sense of how engaged your employees feel right now. You might even break it down per department, sales, marketing, HR, operations, and you might see different results. You might even break it down per gender, for example, or different ethnic background, and you might see different results. You might see that maybe women feel less engaged, or maybe people of color feel less engaged. So start with some facts and figure from qualitative, quantitative feedback, and then try to get some sort of qualitative feedback, which could be collected through one-to-one meetings. So you could ask all of your leadership team to run one-to-ones with their people, specifically around inclusion and engagement. That's going to be less scientific. It's more qualitative, but that's going to get us a sense of how engaged people are. And just look at your attrition rate as well. Who are the last 10 people who left your organization, or the last 5 people who left your organization? Do you notice a pattern there in terms of their background or gender or ethnic background, etc.? And who are the last 10 people that you promoted, or the last 10 people whose efforts you acknowledged? And then again, do you notice a pattern? Are they all from the same background? And so those are the kind of questions you can ask yourself, and the activities you can undertake to really see whether your judgment is being impaired or if it's actual fact. And that's going to help you get more awareness around how your workforce is really feeling.
Yes. And I guess the data that you obtain is also only going to be as good as the questions that you ask. So having those very specific questions about actually, thinking about what we talked about in terms of psychological safety, do you feel that it's safe for you to speak out? Do you feel that it's safe for you to have a voice? Do you feel valued as a man, as a woman? All of that's really going to help people break things down, because I sometimes see employee surveys and think that's not going to tell you any information that's worthwhile.
Absolutely, which is why I always recommend organizations to work with a third-party neutral experts, because that third-party expert is going to give you the objective feedback from your employees. Because if you run everything internally, if you do internal surveys, internal sort of qualitative survey, it's going to be harder to get the truth. Whereas if employees are being surveyed, and I've done that with organizations where they ask me to interview their staff around how they're feeling around inclusion, and you'd be surprised how people open up more, because it's not their boss they're talking to, it's not their manager, it's not even someone from their team or from their organization. So there is less, their barrier just go down, and I get so much more qualitative feedback because I'm neutral, I'm not working for the organization, and then I can share this feedback, obviously anonymously, with the management team to get honest opinion. So really getting a third-party external neutral expert consultant to help with employee engagement survey, qualitative feedback, quantitative feedback is really going to help you get to the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. So for anybody listening, Perrine, where can they get their hands on your book, Inclusion, the Ultimate Secret to an Organization's Success?
Of course, the best place is to go on Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk, wherever you're based. And it's just, you can search either my name, so Perrine Farque, or just if you type inclusion, just the name inclusion, you will see my book coming up there. Or even on my website, it's perrinefarque.com. And you go on my website, perrinefarque.com. I believe it's on the homepage. There is a link to my book. So those would be the easiest places to get my book.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Perrine. I'm sure that anybody that is listening to this will have taken a huge amount of value from your advice about where to start and how to make an inclusive, happy workforce. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. It was wonderful to be with you today.